All right, want to go get started. Um, Welcome everyone to our Summer Scares horror author panel. Today we have McLeod Chapman, Rachel Harrison, who we've had before. Thank you so much for joining us. LaRocca and Paul Tremblay. And just so everyone knows, we will be recording this for YouTube. So if you do not wish to have your face recorded, feel free to keep your camera off. And we will have a Q&A at the end. So if you would like to already put your question into the chat, we will go ahead and look at that towards the last 15 minutes of the panel. Um, and then we'll get to them during the Q&A part. And obviously, please remain muted for the first part of the author panel. And special thanks to everyone the authors who came here. We really appreciate you guys taking your time out of your day to enjoy the Summer Scares author panel with us. My name is Katie, and my colleague Melissa is co-hosting this event with me. And let's go ahead and get ready with all the questions. We've been, like I said, we've been talking about this all month long since we planned it, so we're super psyched. But for those who may not be familiar with you guys, can you please introduce yourselves and maybe a brief description of your book? Paul, if you want to go first.
Oh no. Okay. Hi, I'm Paul
Like,
Tremblay,
why?
author of a bunch of books at this point, but A Head Full of Ghosts, The Cabin at the End of the World, and most recently, which came out in June, a novel called Horror Movie. Oh yeah, and she was holding up, I guess, the Beast You Are paperback came out. Oh, she's got the red edges. Very nice. Yeah, so Horror Movie, I guess, is why I'm here.
Rachel?
Hi, my name is Rachel. I wrote The Return, Cackle, Such Sharp Teeth, which is the Summer Scares pick, Black Sheep, and then my next novel, So Thirsty, is out in September.
Eric?
Hey everyone, I'm Eric LaRocca. I've written a couple books, like Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke. The Trees Grew Because I Bled There. Oh, yep, right there. And my most recent book is a collection of 4 novellas called This Skin Was Once Mine and Other Disturbances, which came out in April of this year.
And you have one coming out next year, right?
I do. I have it's called At Dark I Become Loathsome, and it's through Blackstone Publishing. It's coming out January 28th, 2025.
Nice. And last but not least, Clay.
Hey, my name's Clay. I've written a couple books. Most recently, I wrote a novel called What Kind of Mother? And next year, I have a book coming out in January called Wake Up and Open Your Eyes.
Nice. I'm currently reading this, though.
Oh, that one. Ghost Eaters. I wrote another one called Ghost Eaters.
Yes.
Okay, and then kind of going along with that, now that you have introduced yourself, give us your elevator pitch about yourself. What kind of horror do you write? Why don't we let's start with Rachel this time.
No.
Sorry.
For all the kids in class who don't want to talk today.
Well, it's such a hard thing to like sum up your work. I write, my protagonists are all women. I write, I guess like voicey contemporary horror, that usually has some humor. And I don't know. I want it to be fun, and usually there's some metaphor going on in the book. Yeah, my covers tend to be black or pink. Yeah, that's my deal, I guess. Please go to somebody else.
Okay, I will spare you any further anything. Clay.
I'm all about the vibes, man. I like beach read, like total summer chill, like just laid back, like good beach vibing. And then things go really awful. I think like that's the thing. Like it's good, but then it's like awful.
If you have ever started the first couple pages of Whisper Down the Lane, I don't know if that I would qualify as starting as a beach read, but okay.
I mean, Whisper Down the Lane's a fun one because that's like, I was going to try to pin it as like dark academia, but I can't do that. I don't know. Yeah, that's academic vibes.
Fair enough. Different vibes. Okay. Paul.
Yeah, that's a fun question. Like, it's actually, I enjoy seeing all of us writers squirm at that because it is hard. It's like, how do you see yourself as a writer? It's like, oh man, I don't know. My editor used to call me Mr. Ambiguous Horror, but now she calls me like Mr. Sad Horror. Uh, so like, but how do I view myself? I don't know. Like, I mean, I would say like I view, like I'm sure most everybody here, like horror is just having like so much potential. You can do so many different things with a horror story, and I don't know. My hope is to try to, to keep, well, that's assuming I have done different things, but my aim is to try to do different horror stories each time and maybe, keep that going. With that in mind, like the novel I've just started now is hopefully going to have like a lot more humor to it, maybe a little bit of science fiction, but also going to be sad and depressing and awful too. So I don't know, maybe that's what I am.
Find it hilarious your editor says that you're depressing because I keep laughing, so maybe I'm the rubric one.
Yeah, no, she didn't say depressing, like sad. I mean, that's certainly a fair descriptor, I think, for like, Head Full of Ghosts, Disappearance of Devil's Rock, Cabin, etc. All of them. I don't know. I will say though, like as a young writer or a younger writer, no, definitely younger because I'm not young now. I try to imagine myself as young, but anyway, when I first started writing, everything was horror short stories, and I wore horror writer as a badge. And then, based on something another like well-established writer had said about one of my stories, he said, "Hey, this is really great. It would have been a great story even without the horror element." And I was like, "Oh, I'm going to think of myself then as a writer who writes horror." And to me, that was an important distinction. Didn't mean I was not going to write horror, because that's just where my obsessions and proclivities lie. But for me, it was just a good lesson. Like, hey, you write the story, like serve what it needs to be, and then you let other people figure out what it is after.
Great. And last, Eric.
Yeah, I love this question because I think about like branding a lot and like what I want readers to take away from my work and how, obviously you can't control how you're perceived, but I think I'm really inspired by really transgressive, bleak, upsetting kind of horror. And I like telling it through like a queer lens. So a lot of my work is very gay, and very bleak. I hope it's vicious. I hope it's upsetting, all those nasty things, and I hope it's transgressive, at least a little bit. I'm really inspired by writers like Poppy Z. Bright and Kathy Koja, Dennis Cooper, Clive Barker. So I kind of grew up reading all those amazing writers, and they're very much the reason why I started writing in the first place.
I will say, for everyone who hasn't read Eric, his books will stick with you. This has stuck with me.
Thank
for
you.
better or for worse.
Thank you.
Okay, so going on to our next question. So I'm sure you guys all get this question a lot, but why did you choose to write the horror genre? Was there a particular book, author, or event that got you hooked on it? I guess this time we'll start with Clay.
I mean, I grew up down south, so I feel like, and I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, so Poe was always, he was like our next door neighbor, and I was just kind of highly enamored with that idea of first person narrative, that here's a character who is essentially kind of talking to you, the reader, and a certain kind of barrier just dissolves. And I like first person narrative, like I just loved it because it brought me into the story in a way that third person just never does. And as someone who kind of grew up enamored with theater as well, like I loved direct address monologues. Like I loved when Richard III just started talking, like mugging to the crowd, because it made me feel like I had to look behind me and like, oh, he's talking to me. And like there's just something kind of like exciting about that. And I think Poe he brought me into the story, and just the kind of sheer formula of like, hello, I'm the narrator of the story. Take my hand. I will walk you through this tale. And do you hear that heartbeat in the floorboards? Yeah, I killed my neighbor, but I'm not crazy. And I love that you could kind of walk into one of his stories unaware of the kind of trap being set. And it was all because you were, as the reader, kind of like you let your defenses down by just listening, by reading. And I don't know, I just love that. And so yeah, I think that I would say Poe was definitely like from the get-go. But then there was like Flannery O'Connor. There was this poet named I that I was really really kind of in love with, spelled AI. But they were all writing like, it whether you would call Flannery O'Connor or I horror, they were writing horrific stuff. And when I started publishing, there wasn't even like a horror section at like the local Barnes and Noble. So like horror, like, in a funny way, like I didn't necessarily think of myself as writing horror, but like something kind of like adjacent to it, because there was no bookshelf for it at that kind of cycle in the publishing world. It was dark fiction, it was weird fiction, and yeah, it was. But I guess I would say Poe, old Ed.
Yeah, I think he was definitely a lot of our first inspirations too.
Yeah, he's a keeper.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, I think I wrote my first like 8 grades, like 8 through 10. Each term paper I had to do was on a Poe story, and sometimes the same story. I went to a big public school. No one noticed.
Would you revise? Would you like, my opinion has changed on the Cask of
No,
Amontillado?
it has not. No, no, and I wouldn't do a story that was that difficult to understand either. It was usually something more straightforward.
So, Paul, would you want to go ahead then and say what was your inspiration to the horror genre?
Oh, sure. First, I want to say hi to Lisa's big dog. I can't stop. I want to pet him or her. For me, it was movies were really the first in sort of the Boston area, pre-cable television. Aging myself, there was a program called Creature Double Feature on the weekends, and they would show usually a kaiju movie first, and the second movie was like a B black and white horror movie from the 50s, or sometimes like a Hammer horror film. And the second movies always scared me, even like the stupid ones like Attack of the Killer Shrews. I still vividly remember an Attack of the Killer Shrews nightmare. Although then that morphed into like a Jaws nightmare later too. I have problems. So for me, it was film. I wasn't, ashamed to say I wasn't really a reader as a kid. I was just a child of 80s cable television and just watched everything. And so from ages like 5 to like 21, what I knew of story, aside from doing my high school assignments, because I was a good student, I would do them. What I knew from story structure was all through film. And so like, I feel like I've been playing, 30 years of catch up ever since. It's kind of fun now because I read way more books than I watch movies. I probably only watch like 4 or 5 new ones a year, if that. So I don't know. It's fun for me to have that shift, and in some ways, it's hard. Other than that answer, it's hard to answer it otherwise, because just horror, both like fandom and being a scaredy cat of it, has just been with me my whole life. Like my dad and aunts. My dad was only like 21 years older than me, so he was almost in a weird way, and probably not always the best way, like an older brother instead of a father. So like he was. I remember them coming home from seeing Alien, and just how they were talking about seeing Alien like scared me. Like I was pretty scared of Alien, just from hearing how terrified they were of it. Yeah, I don't know. So horror's just always been around. It's just a thing. It's just a part of me.
Yeah, I think we have all little horror elements in our lives. 'Cause, like, even movies I didn't think were horror, like they have a horror element, and like that's what always stuck with me. That it's really everywhere. Hey Eric, what about you?
Yeah, my introduction to horror was definitely kind of similar to both Paul and Clay. Similar to Clay in the sense that I started out as like a theater kid, really into like playwrights like Edward Albee and Arthur Miller, and Tennessee Williams was like a huge inspiration for me. And I really found myself just so drawn to like the darker elements of his works, especially Williams, because he has like some pretty gnarly stuff in his plays. You know, I'm thinking of like Streetcar Named Desire and Sweet Bird of Youth, Summer and Smoke. Like some of the stuff in there is like very graphic, and you know, you couldn't really do it unless it was like on a Broadway stage. So I came into really just appreciating like dark things, dark content, dark elements in storytelling at a really young age. And that's around the time that my mom introduced me to like old black and white creature features, like Creature from the Black Lagoon. I watched like a lot of the Universal classic monster movies like Dracula and Frankenstein, and I was just like enamored with what I was watching, and but also really frightened of it too at the same time, which was like a really weird, like exhilarating rush, but also like just completely petrified me. It's just like an interesting relationship like with the viewer and horror, like how it's something that repels us but also like compels us to keep watching, or at least for me to like keep studying it and keep examining like why I'm so drawn to it. um but yeah, horror just feels like something that's just so ubiquitous in my life, and something that I've just been inherently drawn to it no matter what.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think we all are in some ways. I'm still trying to get over the clown from Stephen King. So that has affected me my whole life. I can't look at clowns ever again. I see you, Nina. I see you trying to show your shirt. Hey Rachel, what about you?
So I'm kind of like an amalgam of everyone who of all those stories. I was a bit of a late bloomer. I'm very sensitive, and I was always very sensitive to horror. So like I did see Jaws and Alien very young, but like Nightmare Before Christmas scared me when I was like young. I was just like, I my mom told me about it. Like I think I saw the paperback somewhere and I asked her about it and she told me the general premise and I was terrified. I was terrified. Like every time I went into the bathroom, I was like looking for like clown aliens to like come out of the sink. Um, but because of that, I thought I didn't like horror, so I avoided it for a long time. Like even if I like saw a VHS cover in Blockbuster, now I'm aging myself, it would freak me out and like it would keep me up at night. And I would sleep with the blankets over my face, so only my nose and mouth were out so I could breathe. Um, so I was just very, very scared for a long time. And then, but I was always a big reader. Um, and I love film and I love the Twilight Zone. And when I went to college for screenwriting and I was in a screenwriting club and they did a horror screenplay competition. And so and then at the same time, um, one of my best friends is a huge horror buff and she like sat us down and made us watch The Shining, both Kubrick and the TV version. And like, we'd watch like The Ring like she kind of gave me an education. And so simultaneously that was happening and I was in doing this like screenplay competition that I ended up winning. But like when those two things came together, I sort of had my like moment of like I describe it as like a rom-com moment where I was like, we were meant to be together this whole time. Like, so that was kind of my epiphany. And I started writing like speculative horror short stories. And then, yeah, now I'm here. So,
And the rest, as they say, is history.
yes.
Those VHS cassettes were amazing. The covers, like the sleeve art, like honestly, like
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would take those over the almost like over the film, like the actual films themselves, where, you know, not to date myself, but like when I as a kid would walk through the mom and pop video stores, and you would get to the horror aisle and everything is face out, the cover art was always so infinitely more like because you just don't know the story. Like you would have Evil Dead 2 or you would have like Troll. Do you remember Troll? And like the VHS cover art for Troll is basically a troll holding a bouncy like a rubber ball, and it's just like it's just like that's it. and at the bottom it just says "Come closer." And like as a kid, you read that and you're like, I'm not gonna get close. Like there's like, I don't know, just like the level of engagement was just so terrifying. And like I would end up like whatever movie I would make up in my head, you know, was far more scary than the actual movie. Like when I was finally old enough to rent the film itself, like you would watch and be like, oh, Troll's not scary. But like my version of it was like, oh my God. So I'm right there
Yeah.
with you, Rachel.
No, I even did that like as an older, you know, probably in my 20s. I would walk through and just read all the covers because I wasn't going to watch them. They were like, especially the ones I thought were too gory for me. It's like, okay, now I sort of know what the deal is with this movie. I've seen its cover. I know what it is. But no, I would just spend all the time just like going through and knowing like there's no way I can watch this movie, but it was still really cool to be able to, you know, to read the cover.
Where would you draw the line? Like, what was like, no, can't do that one.
I mean, really anything like slashery. So my brother, who's younger, 5 years younger, he was a gore hound and still is. Like, you know, he watched Texas Chainsaw when he was 10. Fifth grade sleepover. I watched it when I was like 34 for the first time. So like I knew these were Dan's movies. You know, and eventually like we met, like he, you know, after I graduated from college, you know, showed me Evil Dead 2. I was like, oh, you know, that movie really sort of was as a big an awakening for me as well as like, you know, reading Stephen King and stuff like that. But yeah, no, I knew like the sections. Oh, that was Dan's section. He's probably seen all these, but I kind of wanted to know about them, but not sit through them.
See, for me, like Evil Dead's great, but like if it goes to like hostile or too gory, like for me, I just can't watch it. It's something like I can read it and that's perfectly fine because it's like Clay said, it's in my head. So I think that's fine. Because then I can imagine it being however gory I kind of want. But once I see it on screen, I'm like, okay, I have to go now.
I remember everyone kind of goes through that phase in like early high school where you're like, you have to go with all of your friends to the movies to see the scariest movie possible and like dare each other, like we should go see this one, we should go see this one. I can't remember what movie it was. I don't even think it was that scary. It was like one of the more science fiction-y ghost ones, but we were sitting there and I realized about 10 minutes in, if I covered my ears, if I couldn't hear it, it wasn't scary anymore. That was always like, if I see it, that's fine. But for me, it was always the sound, the jump scares. Those I couldn't do. I could watch people get like hacked to bits. I could watch the girls coming out of the mirrors with like hair all up. But if the sound, that's always the part that got me. Oh,
Yeah, that makes sense.
My turn for a question. I think I have the ones that are gonna make you like shake your heads at me, and for that, I'm not at all sorry.
I wrote these questions, so
And then I picked the ones that I was like, oh, I want to read that one. So
Brilliant.
I've been binging everyone's books for the last like 2 weeks
I'm so
to
sorry.
try and gear up for this. And it was fantastic. I've had the greatest like 2 weeks reading. But I've noticed that everyone approaches horror a little bit differently. Some of you bring like a macabre lyricism to it almost, but then some of you lead into like the absurdity and bring a little bit more levity to it. How did you decide what kind of like brand of horror you were going to lean into? How did you pick up that particular shirt and put it on and like, this is my horror? This is the horror that I want to put out there.
I don't know why, but the look on Clay's face is making me laugh.
Well, I'm just like, well, you have to tell us who does what, right? Like, who's the one who brings, who's the lyrical one, who's the levity one, who's John,
I think
Paul,
I'm
or Ringo?
probably, by process of elimination, I am probably levity. Like, let's be real here.
So I think I wrote you down as levity too, but I also think Paul is really funny. So I don't know why. Like I said, I just think he's really funny. Eric ranges to the more like definitely like what I consider to be like gory horror. Like if that's your vibe, Eric is your person. And then Clay, like it depends because you've done historical horror. And to me, it's almost like somewhat dark, and then also there's moments of levity. So you go in between for me. What do you think, Melissa?
Yeah, Eric was definitely like the grotesque, the body horror, the lyricism. I read The Trees Grew Because I Bled There, and that was some of the imagery was in that. As much as I was going, ugh, ugh, I was like, wow, it's kind of beautiful in like a really gross way. Um,
you.
Rachel
Yeah.
was levity, but also like anger. I read Black Sheep, and I loved her. I loved the way that she reacted to things. It was very kind of like an emotional take on horror.
You
Clay
should
was
see
also
her.
levity.
You should see her at a convention. She's just a ball of rage. Like people get out of the way. They're like, "Oh my God, Rachel's so angry." Yeah.
I feel like Clay would like at a convention, we have to watch out because he's like running after people shouting con.
Clay was definitely humor, almost absurdity for Ghost. I read Whispered Down the Lane first, and that one was a little bit more grotesque. But then the second one I read was Ghost Eaters, and that one, I guess by virtue of the fact that it's a little more like psychological and it has to deal with a little more drugs, that one, like the imagery kind of played into a little bit more absurdity. And I'm almost done with A Head Full of Ghosts. I'm almost done. I really wanted to finish by today, but I have about 100 pages left. Nobody spoil it for me.
Yeah.
And that one, I think it's a little harder just because that one is dealing with children, but that one feels a little bit, I don't know how to describe this one. I guess it's humor by virtue of looking at it through a child's lens. I would have to compare it to other works to know, like, for sure. I think it's a little bit harder.
Yeah, the
But
last
with
100 pages definitely very happy. They actually break out into like song and dance.
everyone's gonna be friends and everything is
Yeah.
gonna be fine.
Exactly.
Well, it's
Yeah.
funny because like Rachel's books for me, like I noticed like this one, I definitely feel like this is more of like I feel comforted by this book because like even though it has like horror elements, I just feel like the witchcraft and everything always brings me home because I grew up on practical magic. So this for me is just like coming home. But all the others, I agree with Melissa, they're all about like rage and like there's something they have to fight
Yeah.
against the characters and come into their own. So that's just me. Sorry to take up all your guys' time while
Yeah.
we're answering this
No,
question
no.
for you, it looks like.
Let's
No,
answer for each other.
Yeah, I was gonna say, jokes aside, like I agree with your assessment of Rachel's work. So I do think the thing I really admire is how, she described it as like there's fun and there's horror elements, but she slips in sort of that transgressive rage. Not that rage is transgressive, but she slips in stuff that definitely always like gets to me each time.
So what do you guys think about Clay's work?
Lots of crabs.
Lots of crabs.
Well, I think what's like when you were describing lyricism, I thought of Clay because I think like if you've ever heard Clay read, there's like a specific like cadence and like poetry to his work and like a pacing and an intensity and like an emotional intensity in all like that runs through all of his work. And it also like it feels like somebody is sitting you down and telling you like a scary story. It's very atmospheric. It's very like kind of gets swept up in it. And then yeah, there's just this like really could be really terrifying, but like this really like profound emotional intensity. That's what I think of when I think of Clay's work.
I heard Clay read on a rainy Saturday night in Salem, Massachusetts, at a curiosity store. He read a short story about a hammer, and it was one of the most harrowing things I've ever heard. It was phenomenal.
Yeah, every time me and Melissa talk about Clay, she's always like, he just reminds me of a really big theater kid. And there's no more
In
bigger
the best
description
way.
than that. We mean that lovingly.
In the
It's just
best
so
way.
funny because I saw an interview with you and Eric. This was for Fearmongers, and I was watching the live. And just the way you talked, I was like, I just need all the audiobooks. I need all the audiobooks by this man. Because your voice is just so good.
The dulcet tones. I'll take Eric because I feel like, Eric himself kind of mentioned branding and how you're kind of navigating like your voice and your body of work. And I think lately I've been thinking a lot about kind of consent between author and reader. And I always feel like your work kind of probes like where's the line of consensual engagement. And sometimes you find it and then you ask the reader to go further. Like, can you go farther than what you're willing to in this moment? And it's like, I think that the text actually does that in a way where, as soon as, lyrical was mentioned, I was like, that's Eric, because the prose, the kind of text itself kind of seduces you into this kind of like this almost like a lowering of the guard, which is really the wrong move for, I think, an Eric LaRocca book, because like, yeah, I think you need to protect yourself, but the text is always kind of pushed, like it's not daring you and it's not defying you, but I do think it's like it's almost asking you, sentence by sentence, like how far can you go? Can you go this far? And I think the reader has to say, like the reader actually has to ask themselves, can I go this far? And then it's almost like the next sentence or the next paragraph will be like, can you go a little bit further? And in that like constant kind of reevaluation of what you're comfortable with, if you push through your own kind of personal threshold, what's on the other side is almost this, I don't know if it's like euphoria. I don't know. It's like a kind of transcendent quality that only comes after feeling like a little bit of pain, like almost like you actually have to kind of hurt to get through a story by Eric or a book by Eric, because there's a journey to it. And like once you're on the other side of that journey, it like you've gone through an experience that is painful or not, like nauseating, or but you're not the same person you were when you started that book. I mean, I distinctly remember where I was, where I was in a hotel with my family when I was reading Things Have Gotten Worse. And it was like a weekend, like, hey, we're all up in Lake Placid, like let's, and I'm reading like my first Eric LaRocca book. And I had to leave the room. I was like, I had to like shake it off, because like it was like a kind of an unsettling, upsetting kind of experience. And I didn't want to be around, I didn't want to be around my family when I was reading. Like it wasn't pornographic as much as it was just like it just felt like I didn't want to expose them to this book, like for them to be in proximity to it. Like I needed to like jump on the landmine or something. But I do think that that's the quality of Eric's material, where it's like you need to go through a journey to like live it. So yeah, that's my take on Eric's work.
You, Clay, your check's in the mail. I appreciate it.
No, I have to agree though. Like I am not a big like gory horror person, but my friend was like, you should really read this. And it's so interesting how like this one has stuck with me in particular, because I have read a couple others, but none other like this, because you do go through a journey with Eric's works. And it's funny how in this one in particular, it's funny how person who you've never met can affect you so much to the point where you're willing to make interesting choices. And that struck me because I've met internet friends before, and I'm like, man, I feel like Eric really knows how this feels. I don't know why. This before I even met you, but I was like, there's something about this.
Yeah, I grew up, in the chat rooms, so I'm somewhat familiar with it. Nothing like that happened to me, but
No.
could have gone south real fast, as anyone who's been in those chat rooms knows what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Thanks. And last but not least, so about Paul's work, what do you guys think? Since we're reviewing everyone's works.
Who takes Paul?
Iconic.
Sure.
Iconic. I started reading Paul when I was like in undergrad and like grad school. And there was just like such intensity to his work, I felt like. I don't know, it's hard to like distill everything I feel about Paul's work into like, a few sentences, but
It's hard to review your friends, I think.
yeah. I mean, I do think horror movie, The Beast You Are, I love that book as well, but horror movie is exceptional and such an amazing book. Um, I don't know. Someone else talk. I don't know what to say.
I'm
Well,
happy.
thank you.
I'm a Paul super fan, so I think it's interesting to like look at his entire body of work because there's a lot of variety. Like The Paul Bearers Club is one of my favorite books of all time, but that's a very different book from horror movie or Head Full of Ghosts. So but I think some for me, there's something in his work that speaks to the like misfit in me. Um, Particularly with Paul Bearers Club, but you know, Head Full of Ghosts and horror movie too. I think this feeling of like loneliness and like searching for connection. Um, and there is this ambiguity in his work. Like I think of Cabin and like these brutal truths about what it is to like be alive and exist that kind of just like every time I read a Paul Tremblay book, I have to like stop and close it and like sit down and be like, that's something that like I felt for so long but couldn't articulate. And that is so profound to like the experience of being alive. And it's also terrifying. It's like staring into a void. It feels like, but it also, you have that moment and then you feel like, oh, but somebody else feels this too. And so I think that like the feelings of loneliness and am I the only person in the world who has ever felt this way? And then you read his work and you're like, no, someone else has felt this way too. There's like this really like for me a profound sense of connection. And also like he does this all while like telling a really compelling, interesting story with like really dynamic characters and also while like scaring the hell out of you. So I like I, I just yeah, I'm just a huge fan.
Thank you. Thank you both. I mean, I think the cool thing is, to steal what Rachel was saying, I mean, the thing that ties all our work together, I think, is the idea is like, oh, here's four misfits, in certain ways, writing, I mean, that's what art is about, right? The want to communicate, to connect, and, all our stuff definitely connects with each other and it clearly connects with readers. And I think, the horror part of it is like, oh, there are other people who actually think this is cool because that's the hard, I would say it's weird to say it's the hardest part about right now is that horror is cool because for my whole life it wasn't. uh yeah, and my life has been longer than most of the other people here. So I mean, to me, that's always been like part of the joy is the discovery of like, hey, there's other people like us out there, and they see something's wrong, and that's really kind of like a hopeful thing.
Any other thoughts?
Paul pisses me off. His work is so confounding and frustrating because you can talk to 5 different people who read the same book and they're going to give you 5 different interpretations of it. And it's going to be, the editor who says he's Mr. Ambiguous, it's funny because I think he's so hard to pin down and he's slippery. And that's really frustrating as a reader because I want a bow and I want a happy ending and I want everything explained to me and I want to close the book and walk away from it and never have to think about it ever again. But when you read a Paul Tremblay book, it doesn't let you do that. And it's like, well, maybe this is what happened. And you're like, oh, and you have to engage with it. You have to think about it. You have to you actually have to stop and go back and reread. And like, I think that there are so few books out there. And I think I'm thinking specifically of Paul Bearers Club and horror movie where you have an interpretation of it, but then you have to reevaluate. And you're like, wait, do I really feel that? Like you can't get through a Paul Tremblay book without reevaluating your understanding of the book itself. And that is so perturbing because you know, we all kid about Paul being Mr. Ambiguous, but like that living in that liminal space, living in that gray area is, you can't, like, not many people can do that. And I think that's the kind of testament, like the staying power of the staying power of Tremblay is that like he refuses to give you the answers that you so desperately want, and you're left having to find, like, seek out those answers, seek out an interpretation of the material. And it might not be what anybody else read and thinks, you know? It's the inception. It's the last 3 seconds of inception. He's just like spinning that friggin' top. And you're like, it's going to fall. It's going to fall. I know it's going to fall. And he never falls.
It's hard to live that way, though. So, when I teach and the kids ask me, like, what's the answer to the question? I'm like, I don't know. It's 4, or is it? Like, everyone just gets really annoyed. And then they leave 3 and 2-star reviews. No, thank you. Everyone is way too kind, and very talented.
Yeah. Well, I just think it's funny that the way me and Melissa described all of you at the beginning, you all thought it was this different person than who we meant.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just funny because the way we see you is not necessarily the way you see each other. Because I know you guys are friends in real life, so I'm sure you know things that we don't. But I just think that's funny that in the way that we meant, like, how I think Paul's writing is really funny, and how Eric's really gory. You probably thought, oh, we mean Clay or we mean Paul. Like, it's just interesting to me how you guys took it.
Yeah.
Maybe
But
we're just
but-
literary Rorschach tests. Like, it's like,
Yeah.
well, what do you see? Like,
But seriously, Rachel like trashed the San Diego hotel room at StokerCon, or the hotel area, like the whole outdoor lobby. You should have
Don't
seen it the
tell
next
on
morning.
me. Don't tell on me.
Look, guys, what she
I
does
am
in her own
wanted in
time.
San Diego, but for many reasons, mostly my stealing the citrus fruits, but that's neither here nor there.
She will never be at StokerCon again.
I'll be at StokerCon, but not in San Diego.
No,
There's a
that's
warrant
true.
out for my arrest in California.
That's why she's in Jersey right now. She's
Yeah,
hiding.
I'm hiding. I'm not here.
Okay, and on to our next question. So I know some of you, such as Rachel, have chosen to narrate your own audiobooks. I'm just
haven't.
curious. Oh, I thought you did. And I thought you narrated
No.
one of them. Oh, okay. So I'll rephrase that then. So I know sometimes authors have chosen to narrate their own audiobooks. I'm just curious, why haven't you guys chosen to narrate your own audiobooks? Because as I mentioned before, I think Clay's voice is also, like, I've seen Rachel speak. I've seen Rachel like do like chapter experts of her books. I was just curious, what was it a choice that you guys chose not to make?
No one asked me.
Yeah,
No one asked me.
I wish it was a choice. Like, I've volunteered a couple times, like, hey, the Paul Bears Club, I'd love to read Art Barbara. And they're like, yeah.
So it's weird
Yeah.
because, like, normally I thought that would be like a good option to have the author read their work.
I think, well, maybe for some authors, right? It
Depends on the author.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, I think they're telling me, is like, your voice is way too nasally. We don't want you anywhere near a microphone, is one thing they're telling me. But also, I mean, I think honestly these days, with audio productions, just keep getting more and more sort of involved. I mean, there are readers who will actively search out other audiobooks by certain performers and readers. So, unless you're like, I don't know, Stephen King or someone with a velvety, cool voice of, Victor LaValle or Clay, I think most of the publishers are gonna be like, it doesn't really add that much to it. At least that was what it said to me. And then they sent me away.
Well, I guess when it comes to narrating your own audiobook, so they just pretty much are said, okay, we're gonna go get this speaker for you. Have they ever, like how Rachel said, has no one ever asked any of you guys to read? I know, Paul, you said you tried, but Eric, have they never asked you? Or Clay, I still want to know why.
No, yeah, they've never asked me before. I probably wouldn't do it, to be honest, just because I prefer to have someone else read, like a professional voice actor. I just think it'll sound better. Yeah, it's just not something that I would ever really pursue, because I'm not like a born performer, whereas like Clay, I feel like he's like a natural talent, like on stage. Like, Clay would be an amazing audiobook person, I feel like.
Okay, so all of your next books, Clay has to read them.
Yeah, exactly.
You heard it here.
And read them while he's in the same room with his family. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm not going to disagree, but I will say that I do, well, 2 things. I did narrate my very, very first book that came out like 200 years ago,
Hmm.
and it was it got the worst reviews
Oh,
for the
no.
audiobook. They were like, this guy shouldn't read his own material. So that was a little bummer. But I do think that like as audiobooks have kind of evolved in our own kind of art form, there's a certain kind of structure and a certain kind of patois and a certain kind of like there's something to be said about the way in which we or a listener or reader what their expectations are of an audiobook. And sometimes that I know personally, like I can't do that. Like I can't really the kind of audiobook. I don't know why I'm doing this, but like there's like a certain kind of structure to it, like a vibe or a thing. And if you are counter to that, it kind of jars the reader. So I think that it's difficult to do it, and the professionals do it very well. We were talking about Whisper Down the Lane. I think like 3 people read Whisper Down the Lane, but like 3,000 listened to the audiobook. And it was because the narrator is just this amazing narrator, and he brought so much to the table that it kind of like elevated the material. So I count my lucky stars that like people found that book at a point where nobody was finding that book, but it was because of the voice.
Though it's funny when I mention your book, Whisper Down the Lane usually gets mentioned first, which I find interesting.
Those 3 people, they must be very vocal.
They're only in Middletown, New Jersey.
I will be number 4. That's the one I read first.
Yeah.
And I had a very good time reading it.
Big in Jersey.
Okay, so switching a little bit, I would like to talk about characters. I know, Clay, when we talked about influences before, you talked about how you liked the first person narration, like holding your hand and walking you through and kind of getting inside their head. This is the most horror I've ever read in my life these last 2 weeks. And I'm finding that I actually don't think I appreciate getting inside people's heads that much, because I don't know if I like the people whose heads I'm getting into. And I was talking to one of my coworkers, and they were like, well, yeah, you can't get to attach them, because if you attach them, you want them to live through the book. And for better or for worse, maybe that wouldn't make for such good horror. But are there characters that you've written, getting inside their head, or even secondary characters that you absolutely loved, that you would get back into again? Or are there characters you absolutely hated and said, God, I can't wait until this book is over and I don't have to be in their head anymore? I'm gonna leave this open. Whoever character, whoever speaks to you, you can start. Or I'll voluntold, I can do that too.
Da 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 da.
All right, I will voluntold then. Let's go for Eric.
Just thinking. Yeah, I actually really like first person narration because I like being in that character's head. Like even if I absolutely detest them, I find it like really fascinating to be like inside their mind and like watching them make decisions and go through like the movements of the narrative. So a lot of my upcoming work is told in like first person. I'm trying to think, like I have a short story in The Trees Grew Because I Bled There, which is called The Strange Thing We Become, and it's told through like online Reddit posts, like forum posts. So it's not you're not necessarily like inside the person's head, but you're reading what they're writing, which is kind of like by proxy somewhat being inside their mind. I really liked writing that story. Like it was a really smooth process. And I actually wrote a full-length novel based on the idea that germinated from that short story. And it's going to be published like in a couple years from now through Titan Books. But I remember thinking like I really want to go back into that character's mind and just explore more and like her motivations for why she does certain things in that story. Um, and it turned out to be like one of my most favorite things I've written. So characters like super important to me. And you know, even though a lot of the characters I write about do terrible things to each other and to themselves, um, I try to never like judge them and just I kind of just observe and am like a reporter for what they're doing as opposed to like filling in the gaps with my own opinions of what they're doing, if that makes any sense.
It does. The Strange Thing We Become, I actually gasped. I was reading it at work and I was like sitting in our reference area reading it. And thank God there was nobody in there because I like audibly gasped most of the way through it. And I was like, oh, someone's going to think something's wrong. It was devastating towards the end. I'm so excited that there's going to be an actual book for it.
Yeah, full-length novel around that whole idea, more centered around like that one character. So I'm really excited about it.
That's awesome.
AR, can I ask you how you if the approach was different at all, or you felt like it was the same when you were writing the trilogy? You know, and this is presuming, I'm not going to spoil the trilogy. I'm presuming that not every character in the first book dies, and then you have a whole new set of characters in the second and third. But anyway,
Yeah, I mean the trilogy is separate from this project
yeah.
that I'm writing.
But
So
I guess I'm asking, like, did you feel like, oh, these are characters returning, or is just like a continuation of a story?
it felt like a remix, if that makes sense. Like it
Yeah.
felt like going back to square one. And like I loved everything about the story, The Strange Thing We Become. I really love the concept. I love the way it's told. I love the way certain things happen. I love like the denouement. Um, and I just kind of went back to the drawing board and kind of recomposed how I wanted to tell the story. Um, and I broke it into like different sections. So there's like act one and then act two and act three. And they're each told by like a different character. Um, so I guess it kind of like employed a lot of my background in theater too, because I kind of approached every act in the book like it was just this very long monologue what that they're talking to the reader. um I don't know if that makes sense, but that's really like how I approached writing that book. And I think it's like I love the story The Strange Thing We Become, but I love this new project. It's called Each Living Thing Is Here to Suffer. I think it's like a million times more complex and more devastating than the original short story.
Okay, what about Rachel? Tell me about your characters.
I mean, I love my characters. I don't know. I have to live inside their heads, so they have to be it has to be a good home for me, someplace that's good for me to stay for a couple months through a year when I'm working on the book. I was particularly attached to Rory. But I I love them all. I mean, they're pieces of my heart. They're pieces of my damn soul. Like I I love them all, and it's hard to let them go. Um, but I'm usually ready to let them go when the book is done. So I don't think there's been a character that I've been like, I'm done, I'm sick of you. I'm just like, we're ready to like, we've lived, we've loved, we're ready to part ways. And it's kind of where I get. The only one that I had trouble letting go of was Rory. Um, but yeah, some are more fun to hang out with than others, but I love them all.
Good. Paul?
Actually, can I ask Rachel really quickly? I
Yeah.
haven't, I've read just about all your novels, but I haven't read much of your short fiction. Have you ever used some characters from books in short fiction? Has that ever like had an appeal to you, or just not something like, it sounds like you just sort of, those characters are done, which I totally understand. Like the first novel that I got published, they wanted me to write a sequel. It was the hardest thing I ever did because the whole time I was like, I wrote this guy's story. It was really hard to break through that.
No, I haven't recycled any characters. Usually my short fiction are like standalone, kind of random stuff. I think short fiction, to me, I can like explore more ambiguity and more like really unlikable characters. Like I can like go toward insufferable if I want to, because you're not with them the whole book. But I haven't recycled any character. Sometimes I get messages like, I loved Sophie's story from Cackle, I consider it, but it's hard for me to imagine revisiting a chapter unless the demand was so much that it was like, well, if you're going to pay me, I might as well.
Right.
Yeah, I'm in that boat. I would love another end to Sophie's story, and I also want to see these characters from 10 years from now to see where they're at. I really want to know from that first set of short stories. I really want to know. I have a lot of questions. I need to talk to Aaron offline about that, but yeah, I have a lot of questions.
So I mean, I guess characterize really quickly for me. I mean, I'm not gonna say anything really different than what Eric and Rachel had said about like how you hang out with these characters and just sort of think in their heads. Your head and their head are sort of the same for a while, even if they're much different people, obviously. But so I have, aside from the detective novel that I was contractually forced to write a sequel. I generally don't have interest in writing a sequel or to novels or even series, just because I tend not to read a lot of series. But I'll read Eric's though.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, but I have on occasion had some minor characters. Actually, I shouldn't even say that. I've had some characters reappear, like sometimes obliquely, sometimes in like little short stories, like the sisters of A Head Full of Ghosts. Like I would never write a sequel for A Head Full of Ghosts unless I was really destitute. But I kind of like the idea of writing short stories occasionally because their relationship are these two sisters telling each other stories. So I'm like, oh, I could have some, not necessarily Mary and Marjorie, but this is a story like one sister told to the other one kind of thing. And I did have a couple of teenagers from one novel reappear in a different one. And it's not something I necessarily think, oh, I'm definitely going to take these characters and put them back in. It's like in the case of Survivor Song, like there was a point in the book I was like, well, I need this character to come across some zombie experts. And my brain was like, you already know a couple of zombie experts. They still might be local. Why not use them again? And so, then I was actually kind of excited. I was like, oh, it'd be kind of cool to see what happened to these two teenagers, 5-6 years later now. But yeah, otherwise, like I'm definitely not sitting around thinking about, oh, how can I, reuse, character X or this character again.
What about you, Clay?
They could have all this time to come up with a good answer.
He's like, can you come back to me?
Well, no, is the question, what do we think of our characters? Do we like our characters? Do we like living with our characters? And do we ever want to return to them, sequels for them? Ish?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like years ago, I was like, what is that like a name for like a smarmy little kid? And I was like, oh, Benjamin Pendleton. Like that is like the name. Like if you met a Benjamin Pendleton, you'd be like, oh, like that guy's a twerp. And like every time I have to write a twerpy, like repugnant little dude, I'll just say Benjamin Pendleton. Like Benjamin Pendleton has like made so many appearances in like over 20 years of like junk. And like it's always like a version, like maybe it's Billy Pendleton, maybe it's Ben Pendleton, but like Benjamin Pendleton has been this like all-encompassing like petulant little boy who like just will always pop up. So if you're ever reading anything of mine and you see the name Benjamin Pendleton, he is a legacy character who has no identity other than his name. and he's just a jerk. Like he's just a little, like you just want to like, so yeah, pop his balloon.
But he's like, I have made an enemy. I don't know why, but he now live in my
Yeah.
literature
I
forever.
need to go to like Facebook and like just search for all the Benjamin Pendletons because I'm sure there's probably one who's like, "Wah, Google."
Okay, so I'm gonna ask this next question, but if anyone after this, we're probably gonna switch over depending upon the time to some questions. So if anyone wants to start typing those in the chat, feel free. But this next question is purely something that I really want to know if you guys have ever considered. So truly believe you guys are all friends in real life. Have you guys ever considered either writing a collection of short stories together or considering like a full novel together? Or I know Paul's been part of a cinematic project, but I feel like a book of short stories would be more possible. Is this something you guys have ever considered possibly doing together?
I think we've been
If
in
you're-
anthologies together.
Yeah.
I think that's
So I guess this
happened.
already kind of counts.
But I don't think we've ever, any of us, there's other, like, been like, let's do it. I think it just sort of happened.
Yeah, because I know you
Yeah.
guys are all different like versions of horror, but I think it would be interesting.
Collaborating is hard. You know, it's like any other muscle. I mean, it's almost like another way of, I mean, and I say this only because in a couple of times in like my first, I guess, 10 years, you know, I co-wrote a couple of short stories with people, and then Stephen Graham Jones and I co-wrote a young adult novel that was published by a now defunct publisher back in like 2014. And working with Stephen was amazing. And it became like this weird hybrid of like both of our voices, which was kind of fun by the end. For me, the hard part was I would spend like 2 weeks on a section and I would send it to him thinking, okay, now I have time to do my own thing. And he would send back his section the next day, maybe sometimes within the same 2 hours. It's like, Steven. But yeah, I mean, with, you know, publishing schedules, and it becomes harder because then it's even just like from a business side of things, like which agent are you going to use to promote,
Mhm.
or which agent you use to try to sell. I mean, that happened with Stephen and I back in like 2013 when we had this weird book. Yeah, so I don't know, like, you know, if and when I quit teaching, I would be open to more trying other things like that. But, you know, for now, like it's hard enough to get my contractual stuff done for the moment.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Gabino Iglesias always does this amazing thing where he utilizes social media to be like, I have an idea. Like, I want to do this kind of anthology. Who wants to do it? Who, you know, and people listen to him. Like, I feel as if, I don't know if it happens every time, but I do know that there have been moments where he will float an idea via Twitter and he'll be like, I want to do an anthology around this theme. Who wants to do it? And you know, publishers, I don't know if there's like a back channel where like someone like, but it seems as if like the next day or a week later, like that thing that he floated suddenly kind of comes into being. So it's not about it's not internal to this quartet of authors, but I do know that there are those writers out there who have the kind of like the mots to like make it so, like make the thing happen. And I don't know, I'm always kind of blown away when that happens. So whenever Gabino says like, let's do this, the rest of us will just follow him.
All right, well, if it ever happens, you heard it here first. So okay. Melissa, should we ask one more question before going on to?
I think we can do one short one.
I think we have one more time.
Tell me one thing that you're currently reading or watching that you're super excited about.
Well, I
I'm
just
okay.
recently finished Eric's forthcoming novel, At Night I Become Loathsome. Eric, my brain is old, so I always screw up titles. Did I say the title correctly?
At dark.
At dark. I always want to put in At Night. It's I can't stop it. It's in my head. Anyway.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's fine. It's fine.
So my butchering part of the title, regardless. It's an amazing novel. I'm really looking forward to people, to readers reacting to it. And I don't know if I don't think I mentioned this to you in text, but it was funny. Like a few weeks ago, we had an event. We were talking about Chuck Palahniuk and how one of your favorite novels of his is Haunted, and it was funny. Maybe partly because you told me that, I was kind of reading that in my head a little bit, because it's not separated by chapter into people telling stories, but there's a lot of people telling some really disturbing stories within the larger whole thing of a novel. So, you know, I love Chuck's work, but I think you did a better job. 'Cause I think the thing with Haunted is the connective tissue sort of falls apart. It's a great collection, but it doesn't work as a novel. Whereas Loathsome is which I'm going to call it.
That's what I've been calling it too.
It becomes a novel, or it works, great as a really disturbing, but like soaring and grotesquely beautiful novel. And one more from a Spanish writer, Virginia Fieto. I'm probably butchering her last name. It's Feito. She wrote a really wonderful mystery a few years ago called Mrs. March. And then early next year, she has a book coming out called Victorian Psycho. And all you need really is the title. And you can sort of imagine what it might be. But even whatever you imagine it might be, it's better. It's so damn good. I can't wait for people to read that one.
Rachel, what about you?
I recently binged Interview with the Vampire, the new series on AMC, and it's amazing. So I highly recommend that. And then I'm reading I Am Legend right now.
I do also love the new Interview the Vampire season. It's
Okay.
fantastic.
It's so good.
Clay, what about you?
I just finished reading Cuckoo by Gretchen Felker Martin.
Mhm.
Yeah.
My God, that book. That was an
Very
amazing
good.
book. That book
Yeah.
blew me away. And I'm gonna totally humble brag and say that I had access to a rough draft, first draft, second draft of the next Rachel Harrison novel. And I think it might be her scariest book
Oh,
yet.
thank you.
And it is fun. Like, you're kind of alluding to the friendships of the four. And I think that one of the things that has been very beneficial to meeting these authors and respecting them as authors is that we've like occasionally we can lean on one another and like ask for feedback, and having like looking at something that starts here and then becomes what it eventually becomes. I can say that like in its first draft phase, it is the scariest thing. So I can't even imagine what it will be when it hits the actual shelves.
Exciting.
Thanks.
Yes,
Clay.
I already have it pre-ordered at Dog Eared Books, so I am so looking forward to receiving it.
That's so he's talking about.
I'm talking
No,
about
I'm trying
next
not-
year.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
Rachel-
I thought you were
Rachel's
talking
like-
about
she's
So
like-
Thirsty,
sorry. I
'cause
just don't
that
want you to
hasn't come
open
out
up So
yet.
Thirsty and expect it to be
Yeah.
big. So Thirsty is not there's moments, but So Thirsty is not super scary. So
Yeah,
I don't want to.
I didn't know he was talking post. I was wondering, I'm like, am I thinking of the right one?
No, I just don't want to have people's expectations for So Thirsty be like expecting it to be terrifying and instead get like horny vampires. Like this is
Clay said this was the
2025.
scariest book that he's ever read. This is like sexy vampires. What's Clay
You
needs
said
to
the
get
next
out
one.
more.
It was not that far off.
Yeah.
I
Book
know Rachel's like,
yeah.
I'm already in 2025, everybody.
No,
Like,
we
this is
all
what-
are. All the authors, by the time our books come out, we're like on to the next thing. So, but thank you, Clay. That was very kind of you.
All right, so to go in some of the questions from the chat. So Arlene says a question for everyone. Has anything you've written really frightened you or given you nightmares?
Nope. I'm too scared of everything else. I'm too close to the gears of my own stuff.
Do nightmares about the writing process count? Like I've had nightmares of like deadlines or like revisions, but I've had those plenty of times.
Yeah.
I will say, I thought you were being haunted for a moment, Clay, because earlier there was like a person that walked by, and I was just like, Clay has a ghost in his house.
It's
That's
quite
what's
possible.
happening.
Quite possible.
I like wish I wasn't so desensitized to what I write about. Because I feel like I'm constantly chasing a high that I probably won't ever experience again. Like when I saw the movie High Tension or Martyrs for the first time, like those like new French extremity films that are just so like visceral and like in your face and just so upsetting to watch. Um, I wish I reacted more to stuff like that. And I feel like I'm constantly looking for books and films that really like shake me. Um, I did want to shout out quickly, like stuff that we've been reading recently. Like I wanted to shout out, I'm reading a book right now that it's coming out next year in March by an up and coming novelist. His name is Alex Gonzalez, and the book is called Wrecked, R-E-K-T, and it is so remarkable. It is such an upsetting book, actually upsetting me to read. It's absolutely amazing.
Wow.
About like loss and oh, you have a copy. Cool.
Yeah, I have a copy too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's about
Hey.
loss and
Sorry, Rachel.
It's like, what about me?
yeah, sorry, Rachel. But it's about like loss and AI and like internet lore, culture, toxicity, masculine, toxic masculinity, all of those things just wrapped up in this really awful, just awful book, complimentary, not derogatory.
Yeah.
It's just a feel bad book, and I'm like halfway through it, and it's just remarkable. So yeah, shout out to Alex Gonzalez.
Yeah, sorry if I got to get to get your book recommendations there.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I was gonna get it in no matter what.
Yeah, yeah. Authors always like talking about more books, so. All right. Did anyone have any more comments on the thing that's frightened you besides Clay's being frightened by deadlines, which I totally understand?
Okay,
Melissa, you want to?
so our next question is for Clay. Are you mapping out your next novel with index cards on the board to your side?
And also,
Uh,
how can you see that?
That's the last book, the Wake Up and Open Your Eyes. I haven't taken it down, but yeah, I need to. Maybe this will prompt me to do it.
This is Clay's version of a murder board.
It needs more red thread.
Mm.
So Nathan then asks, haven't had the chance to read every author featured here. They'll give a shout out to LaRocca. Your first collection was amazing. The story bodies are for burning, and its exploration of intrusive thoughts have stayed with me, and I think about it often. I have a question for all authors here. I'm currently an unpublished author. I've mostly been submitting to the bigger horror magazines. When trying to get that first short story publication, would you recommend setting the goalpost lower to get started, to get to know some people involved in this space? Or do you think I should keep aiming high since visibility matters more than the number of publication credits? I imagine there's merit to both, but I would like to hear an opinion from people with experience.
Yeah, so like this is not necessarily the right answer. I'm just going to give you sort of my opinion and sort of when I first started writing in the early 2000s and when I was submitting, I always submitted to the highest paying markets first. I figured I would let them say no and not like pre-say no for them, and then sort of just work my way down. And I found eventually I would start getting rejections that actually had like some comments from the editor, like, hey, we like this, maybe even, hey, start sending, them asking for stories and just, I was just really patient with it. And I know that's from, now compared to, geez, 20 years ago at this point, the biggest difference is obviously social media, et cetera. And I think the hardest thing, and I think I'm sure we all four of us struggle with, even us, like we've had, what new writers would certainly describe as success. I mean, I think I would describe as success as well, but like you know, you see other people doing all this amazing stuff, and you know, and you're very happy for your friends, you're very happy for people in the community, but at the same time, you just start like, oh my God, I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough. I must get something out now. And I think I can only imagine for newer authors, that's a really destructive kind of thing. So my advice would just be, you know, give yourself permission to be patient, which is hard. Um, but like be patient and be kind to yourself because it is hard. It sucks getting rejected. Yeah, like I just got rejected last month, like, and it took me a couple drafts for a short story. Um, even texting with Steven today, I was complaining about it. But yeah, so I would suggest send the story to the highest places, you know, see what happens, and while you're waiting, write the next thing.
I think that's great advice. I would echo that.
It's kind of amazing how like we're all still getting rejected like a lot. I get rejected all the time. Maybe I should speak for myself,
Yeah.
but like I feel like rejection is just like a constant part of it.
Are you white as
We're-
well, like me?
I mean, I feel like I talk to my circle of friends about it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you know, didn't get this. Like, you know, that there is that I don't know, like you know, to demystify like whatever we're kind of attributing to like the higher goal poster, the success, like they're all still getting rejected. Like everybody's getting rejected in some shape or form. So like, I don't know, like I guess my answer to the question is start high, and like a story finds its home, and it's just the patience of like it landing somewhere. So, you know, if you begin with the New Yorker and then work your way down to my zine, like there's a lot of room within that like you can find a place, and like it's what's that game where it's like the ball drops and it like like it just lands somewhere. And you know, I always feel like you have to get in a cycle of like you submit, it gets rejected, you resubmit it somewhere else, it gets rejected, you resubmit, and it lands. And then you have to, yeah, what Paul's saying about just working on the next thing while doing that so that you're not kind of completely dwelling on the one thing that's on submission.
I really like the next question. Christy asks, do any of the authors identify or feel kinship with any classic horror monsters or creatures? This is inspired by Eric's mention of the creature from the Black Lagoon.
Oh, this is a good question.
It is.
I've always like really identified with the monsters in Nightbreed, Clive Barker's adaptation of his novella Cabal, because the monsters in that film, like you feel empathy for them, and they end up being, they're like the misfits, obviously, at the start of the story, and they feel, you know, disenfranchised and, uh, you know, ostracized from the larger community, which is really how I felt growing up as, you know, being gay in a very small town, conservative small town in Connecticut. Um, but yeah, I think I feel just a kinship with monsters in general because I feel like the monster always represents like the other in some way, the thing that's different, the thing that's on the outside. Um, so you know, like I started watching those monster movies at a really young age, and Creature from the Black Lagoon, like I felt sadness for the creature, how, you know, upset he was that he couldn't kidnap Julia Adams, the love interest in the movie. You know, you feel sorrow for some of these creatures who are just like misunderstood, and uh, they're so different from everyone else, obviously. But yeah, I definitely feel kinship with like monsters of all kinds, and that's why I love horror in general. I love monsters.
Paul,
Oh,
I
did
saw
you-
you holding up your.
Sorry.
I was like,
Like,
did you put up Godzilla's? Because if
Yeah,
so, that
There's
is
three
awesome.
of them. Yeah. But I don't really identify with Godzilla though. Uh, I mean, I love Eric's answer. I would say in addition to that feeling, for me, especially when I was a kid, it was that feeling of powerlessness. And to see other people feeling that on screen, it felt like, oh, it's okay, you know, even though it was terrifying me, it was okay. Like, and that's something I just feel like I continually sort of explore, is the idea of feeling powerless, but almost like in an awe way at times too. Like there's the fear, but there's the awe of being confronted by, especially if it is a supernatural thing, ambiguous or not. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I was always someone who just dwelled on worst case scenarios, so I couldn't help but think, oh man, what if Godzilla was attacking? What am I going to do? What if, you know, substitute any sort of monster for that? So like, I have my favorite monsters, but I don't know if I necessarily, envision myself as them.
I think I like monsters because of they're powerful, and I never felt powerful. Like I never felt like I always felt like I couldn't control what was happening to me or things around me. I think like seeing Carrie as a young girl just made me feel amazing because it was like, she has power and she's using her power. She's not a monster, but like to me, like thinking about monsters, I think about what would I do if I had that power. And I do have a lot of anger, I think, pent up anger, and like I I I don't know, maybe my books are a little bit of rage fantasy, like of what I would do if I could do something. So I think there's not a specific monster, but like I like to think about specific monsters in my books, like werewolves or vampires, witches, whatever, and think about that exploration of power and the lack of it in my own life.
Yeah, I don't think I've identify as a particular monster, but I do distinctly remember moments of watching films and feeling empathy for certain monsters. Like I think I had a lot of empathy for Jason Voorhees. Like, this like poor little kid that gets kind of like, loves his mama and like just gets wrapped up in this kind of mess. And like even like Leatherface, like there's that scene in Texas Chainsaw Massacre where he gets scolded and he just like sulks off into the corner and he's just like kind of like sitting there and he's really kind of like sad and he's licking his lips. And like you're just watching that and there's like that's like human being like right there who's gone through some intense stuff, but like there's still something there that I felt like, oh, I don't know, like I do, and maybe it's something specific to film, but I do remember those moments, even like at the end of Psycho with Norman Bates, and he's just in that interrogation room and he's got the blanket over him. Like there's just something, I don't know. I'm not saying like I side with them or that I want to be them or grow up to become them, but like there's just this moment of like everything they've gone through, like there's like an identifiable moment of empathy where it's just like, wow, you like circumstances have brought you to this place. And that's got to be tough. You killed a lot of people, but still.
So I really like this. So this next question is, Eric, so this obviously for Eric, how does your process differ when you're writing a play like General Hacksaw versus a novel or novella?
It's a great question. So Gentle Hacksaw, for those of you who don't know, was a play that I wrote and had produced at Storyfest last year. And Clay read the stage direction, so Clay was involved with that, which was cool. So how does it differ? I mean, I started writing theater like at a really young age, and I mentioned before, like a big fan of like Edward Albee and Tennessee Williams. So I definitely am like a student of like quick banter, like dialogue. And for me, like my plays are always like one location, two or three characters, like minimal characters interacting with one another. And um I think it's different from writing my novellas and novels, but it's also like I feel like I'm also using kind of the same muscles, if that makes sense, because a lot of my novellas and novels take place in like one location usually. So like my book that just came out, The Skin Was Once Mine, pretty much all of those pieces take place in like one or two locations. They're not, not a lot of locations. In fact, the last story in the collection, called Prickle, is very much like a play, feels like a play, but you're just reading it instead of like watching it. So I think, like, as far as the differences, I think it's just like format, like that's a big difference. But otherwise, I feel like I'm using the same sort of muscles when it comes to creating like a strong narrative and crafting like compelling characters that are really interesting. I think the big difference is that with fiction, you can really go into the interior of someone's mind and really like show or explain what they're thinking, that you can't really do that with theater. So theater has to be more like active and direct, whereas fiction, you can get a little bit more like metaphysical,
Katie, since we only have about 2 minutes left, I wonder if maybe for our last question, we could just ask everyone to give like one or two like small pieces of advice for any aspiring writers. Doesn't have to be horror writers, just maybe in general, to kind of end today.
It's fine since we only have about 2 minutes left. I know Paul has to go soon.
Yeah.
Hey, Paul, you're muted. No, I love the
Arg.
facial expressions
Yeah.
without the dialogue.
It's gonna be really basic, but you have to read. You have to read, and read widely. Read. This is also if you're a horror writer, yes, read horror, but you also have to read other stuff too. Like read everything. That's where some of your best ideas are going to come from. I'm sort of right now in the middle. After I finish Eric's book, I'm sort of put myself on a little bit of a horror reading sabbatical. Just I love reading it, but I need for the book I'm working on, I need to read just some other stuff just to have some other ideas happening. And then I always come back like super excited, to read horror again. So yeah, read.
Persistence. I would, so sorry, I kind of
No,
just
go ahead.
persistence. It's a marathon. It's not a race. Like I think there's like, for me, I thought I would get to a point and be like, I'm successful now, but it always moves. So you just have to savor the joy of writing and just keep doing it.
Eric, any advice?
Yeah, I mean, both what Clay or Paul and Rachel said are perfect. I would add, I mean, Paul said this before, but like patience is a really big thing. Publishing moves like really, really slow, unfortunately. And it's easy to get caught up in like comparing yourself to others and like, oh, I'm not publishing enough, I'm not writing enough. But just be kind to yourself, really, because that's when you create the best art. And that's what the goal at the end of the day should be, is to create art that you really believe in and that you can stand behind and be proud of.
Clay, if you want to round us out in our last like 5 seconds.
Love yourself. Be nice to yourself. Like practice radical empathy for yourself. Like it's just so hard to be nice to yourself. Like you're going to be the worst critic, your own worst critic. But like, I don't know, love. I'm being so honest. Like I'm trying to learn how to love myself right now. So like, it's never too late to learn how to love oneself.
All right, well, thank you everyone for attending today. Everyone in the comments is saying thank you all for being here, and I appreciate you all taking the time. This was I always love talking to you guys, so this was really fun. So thank you guys for taking the time. I'm loving learning more about your works and everything. This was really nice. So thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Enjoy Summerween, and thank you all again for being here. Have a good night, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
everybody.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everybody.
Jersey.